If you have a Bible and you'd like to follow along, please turn it to 1 Samuel chapter 8. This is where we'll spend our time today. Way back in the beginning of the Bible. First few books. 1 Samuel chapter 8. There's a part of us as human beings, and I guess all of us are fairly well aware of it, wherein we just can't be ruled. There's a part of us that no matter what the governmental system involved, we can't be ruled. Now, we like the convenience of a strong central governmental rulership in some fashion or another, but we don't like the restrictions that come with that paradigm. America is a really strange experiment in which we've harmonized liberty and law, which are actually two polar opposites. But this picture of being ruled is one that was a large feature of the history of Israel. And I think we could learn some things from it. Let's take a look at the text. I'll begin reading in 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 1. In his old age, Samuel appointed his sons as judges over Israel. The name of his firstborn son was Joel. The name of his second son was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. But his sons didn't follow his ways. Instead, they made money dishonestly, accepting bribes and perverting justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and approached Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, "Look, you're old, and your sons aren't following your ways, so now appoint us a king over us to lead us, just like all of the other nations have." But this request displeased Samuel, for they said, "Give us a king to lead us." So Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, "Do everything that the people request of you. For it's not you that they've rejected, but it's me that they've rejected as their king. Just as they have done from the day that I brought them up out of Egypt until this very day, they have rejected me and served other gods. This is what they are also doing to you. So now do as they say, but seriously warn them and make them aware of the policies of the king who will rule over them." So Samuel spoke all of the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. And he said, "Here are the policies of this king who will rule over you. He'll conscript your sons and put them in his chariot forces and in his cavalry. They'll run in front of the king's chariot. He will appoint for himself leaders of thousands, leaders of 50s, as well as those who plow his ground, reap his harvest, and make his weapons of war and his chariot equipment. He will take your daughters to be ointment makers, cooks, and bakers. He'll take your best fields and vineyards and give them to his own servants. He will demand a tenth of your seed and the produce of your vineyards. He will give it to his administrators and his servants. He will take your male and your female servants, as well as your best cattle, your donkeys, and assign them for his own use. He'll demand a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will be his servant. In that day you will cry out because of your king you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord won't answer you in that day." But the people refused to heed Samuel's warning. Instead they said, "No, there will be a king over us. We will be like the other nations. Our king will judge us, lead us, and fight our battles." So Samuel listened to everything the people said and reported it to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, "Do as they say, and install a king over them." Then Samuel said to the men of Israel, "Each of you go back to your own city." So, the people are dissatisfied with their present paradigm. Now, up to this point, they have been ruled by judges. Samuel being one of them, Eli being one of them, and you go back and you read about Samson and Gideon and all of the other judges. Deborah was a judge. And at this particular point in their history, about 25 years have passed since the Philistines have been driven out. Samuel, if you go back and read from chapter 4 forward, you can read the history of all these events. The ark was taken, the Philistines had it. The ark caused all kinds of problems for the Philistines. They brought the ark back. The Philistines had attacked Israel. God had gone before Israel and defeated the Philistines. And 25 years have passed now where they've been free from the threat of the Philistines, and they've gotten comfortable. That's what it boils down to. They've gotten comfortable. In the chapters that I referred to, chapter 4 and forward, Samuel had called the people to come back to the Lord, to repent. And they did. They repented from their Achilles heel, which was always idolatry. Now, what we have to do, I think, when we read the Old Testament and we read about the idolatry of Israel, we've got to be sympathetic to that. It's not that they're evil. It's that this is who they are. They're Semites. Abraham came from Ur of Chaldee, which became Babylon. It likely is not. Abraham was enmeshed in polytheism like every other Semite was in those days. It's just that God chose Abraham, knowing that Abraham would respond to him and do what he had said. But when they were in Egypt, they adopted the paganism of the Egyptians to a large extent. After the Exodus, you read over and over and over again, they returned to what they knew. They were there at Mount Sinai, that God had just parted the Red Sea, the chariots had gone across, and the waters had swallowed up Pharaoh's army. They had seen all of that. They get to Mount Sinai, God's got the light show going on up on the top of the mountain, smoke and fire and thunder and everything else. They're afraid of the mountain entirely because of all this, and yet, after a month, they ask Aaron to cast a golden calf for them because why? They need a God. The one up there is not getting it done for them. This is the problem with, and I'll just say it for what it is, with Judaism and Christianity. The God who exists, the real one, the only one, there's no image. There's no image. There's nothing to look at to say there's God. And humans, for whatever reason, we need that in some way. One of the denominational structures, the Eastern Orthodox and Greek Orthodox, and the Roman Catholics as well, they use icons. Now we as Protestants look at that and say, well, we don't like that. We think there's something wrong with it. They're not using the icons as idols. They're using them as reminders of the God who is that they cannot see, this invisible being, immaterial being who we worship, who we talk about, but we can't see. And there's another aspect of worship with regard to God in Judaism. It's very austere. There's no sensuality in the worship of God. However, in the pagan worship, there's plenty of it, right? All kinds of stuff going on there that we would call sensuous. So there's a problem, and it's hard for people. And as we go forward today, we'll see that it's somewhat hard for us to hang in there when we're dealing with a God who is an immaterial being that we can't see. Now, prior to this event where we are today, Israel asking for a king, God had performed many miracles regarding the Philistines, regarding the ark, but it's not sufficient. They're right back where they always were. We need something we can see. So give us a king. The times are changing. Israel is a kind of a loose confederation of sovereign tribes. They're not a nation. They're just not. You've got the tribe of Benjamin, you've got the tribe of Reuben, you've got the tribe of Gad, you've got the tribe of Judah, you've got all these tribes, and they're all sovereign. They're all almost like independent nations unto themselves. They fought each other through Israel's history. There were times when the tribes were fighting each other militarily. The judges would go from tribe to tribe to tribe. They would travel and they would settle cases, disputes, legal disputes, land issues, all kinds of things within the tribes. But think about what an incredible situation this is for the people of Israel. It's a freedom that we don't know even in this country. In some ways there's similarity. The individual sovereign tribes, we have the individual sovereign states. And in each state there are different laws, different restrictions, different freedoms. Very much like that in Israel. Very much like that. But a lot of freedom. You just didn't have this central government calling the shots for you. But there was a problem that surfaced in it. The same kinds of problems we have. You notice what it says, the last verse in the book of the Judges. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes. And that's exactly what's going on here. The elders of Israel were rightly nervous in this paradigm. They thought, We look around us, we see the goyim. When you see the word nations in the Old Testament, that's the word goyim. Goyim. We see the goyim. They all have kings. They all have central governments. They've got armies. The leaders of Israel recognized that there was some advantage to having a strong, centralized governmental system. Samuel's sons had been appointed by Samuel to continue in judgeship, but they were corrupt. They were totally corrupt. Just like Eli. His sons had become corrupt before him, and Samuel became the judge. Eli, from what we can gain from the text, it looks like Eli was just too lax. In Samuel's case, it looks like Samuel was gone too much. He had to travel about as a judge. So the people are complaining about the corruption in Samuel's sons, and they want somebody that's just going to be the leader that they can have some confidence in. They want to be like the Goyim. And this is the intrinsic problem with where Israel is relative to where they stand before God. God didn't want Israel to be like the other nations at all. He wanted them to be different. He wanted them to remain in His care with Him as their king. And the people are looking around and saying, the way things look around us, it's just too alluring. It looks too simple. It looks too comprehensible. We want to be like the other nations. Now, I think about this in terms of prayer for us today in our modern experience. How many nobody should raise their hand or anything, but how many of us would say that we are frustrated in prayer? Right? How many of us have things that we've been praying for years to see God accomplish? And God has not done those things for reasons of His own. I have had it said to me from unbelievers, and I've even heard Christians talk this way, people who are believers talk this way. Isn't it irresponsible to not just do something as opposed to just pray about something? Why don't you grab hold of it with your hands and do something about something? Praying about it, anybody can do that. What's to be accomplished there? Now, I don't agree with that, but I can understand the sentiment fully because we don't see God. If I see someone over there and they ask me, as we will do when we close the service today, there was somebody we were supposed to pray for today that I forgot, and we pray for them, there's nothing to be seen that's going on. We don't have anything that happens that tells us that there's something moving. Now, if you go do something, you know what's going on, right? This is the problem that Israel faced. They could not see God, but they could see a king. They knew when the king gave an edict that they were to obey it. They understood that. They didn't have the military leaders for protection. They didn't have an organized military with a hierarchy in Israel. They just didn't have it. A trained, standing army. The other nations did. The Jews wanted to be like the other nations in relying on those things that they could see. They didn't want to be as they were, relying on the God that they could not see. And this is a huge turning point for them. Huge turning point. Long, slow decline is beginning right here from the simplicity of just being gods and having God fight the battles for them. They were turning to human solutions for the solutions to their problems. And this is the worst judgment you could possibly get from God. The worst judgment we can get is when we complain, and God steps back and says, if that's the way you want it, go ahead. That's exactly what He's doing here. He's giving them as a judgment, give them what they want. Give them exactly what they want. And then Samuel stands in front of them and God says to Samuel, look, tell them what it's going to cost them to have a king. So Samuel does. They hear the whole cost, but they don't care. This is one of the great failings of human nature. We pass off to the next generation the difficulties that we have today. We don't face them ourselves. We hand them off. We say, we'll let that debt pile up and we'll let the next generation take care of that for us. We like the life we have now here. And that's exactly what Israel is doing here in this wanting a king. They are passing to the next generation the problems that a king will bring. And they didn't realize when they made this decision what it was going to cost them. It took a long time for the cost to show up. But then Solomon came along. And Solomon taxed them to oblivion with his building programs. They compared Solomon's taxation to being whipped with scorpions. That's how they described it. And the people cried out. You go and read the result of all of this. When Solomon's kingdom finally reached its maturity and it was time for Solomon to be gone, Rehoboam and Jeroboam came along and the nation was split in two. That's what it cost them. What God had spoken had come to pass. And we're in the same predicament as followers of Jesus. Exactly the same. We want something more tangible instead of just the invisible God to carry us. We want security of living here on this earth, just as Israel did in the time of Samuel and then subsequently Saul. They and we see something. I guess I do understand it as being a human being myself. We see the frail human as somehow superior to reliance upon the invisible maker of the universe. And God is saying to them, said to them the same thing He's saying to us. He's saying, I want to be your king. And He doesn't say that because He's looking for the accolade or He's wanting the crown. He doesn't say it for that at all. I mean, after all, if the whole universe were evaporated, God would still be God. So it's not anything He's gaining. He wants to be our king purely, purely, purely in a giving fashion because it's best for us. And it was best for them, but they couldn't see it. The huge lesson here, at least for me, is that reliance upon the invisible God is a reliance that is far more confidence-bearing than anything we can rely on within ourselves. But it's so hard. It's so hard to see. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, I'll stay here as long as it takes as we